we get started? All right.
Sorry,
Yeah.
Sheila.
Michael, can you mute yourself? Yeah, thanks.
Very loud. So we're gonna record this session because we're gonna put it on our podcast. So just letting you know, and that's it. Go, Saskia.
Let's get
right. Good. So welcome everyone, and to our second session of the seminar series, Future Foods for a Sustainable Planet. Charlotte, Emily, and I will be hosting today's session. My name is Saskia. I'm a PhD student at the University of Queensland in the Department of Nutrition and Food Science.
I am Charlotte, and I'm a PhD student at the Center for Crop Science at the University of Queensland.
And hey everybody, I'm Emily. I'm the president of the QSA, and I'm a PhD at the Center for Animal Science. So, hello.
The seminar series serves for innovation, collaboration, and discussion among the 4 QAAFI research institutes and industry for securing a sustainable food production. And last week, we had Annie Osborne from the Good Food Institute, who talked about the purpose and importance of investing in the development of alternative proteins as a sustainable way to feed the growing population. And we specifically discussed plant-based and cultivated meat, its positive impact on the environment, and challenges that still need to be coped with, such as improving the nutrition of plant-based meat. In today's session, we are going to discuss what are the current challenges of our food system under climate change, and how can we influence sustainable practices through science and innovation. And now I will hand over to Emily, who will introduce today's panelists.
Thank you, Saskia. Today we have an excellent panel of QAAFI researchers with us. Please welcome Associate Professor Yasmina Sultanbawa. Hi, Yasmina. We have Professor Elizabeth Dan, Professor Lawrence Hoffman, and Professor Ian Goodwin. Thanks for joining us. We have prepared a few questions for the speakers, but before we jump in, some housekeeping rules. During this session, please keep your mic muted. You can ask questions on the chat and unmute yourself at the end. All right? I'll pass it now to Charlotte.
Hi, so could you please, to the speaker, could you please give us a short introduction about yourself and what you are currently working on? Not very long, so just very quickly. Thank you very much. Who wants to start first?
I think Ian should start first because he's done it before. Hi, Pia. How are you?
What? I mean, you're making me go first. What you really mean is because I'm the list.
No, definitely not.
Okay, well, so I'm Ian Godwin, and I've been at UQ since before nearly all of you were born. And I'm not joking because I actually started here as an undergraduate student in 1980, believe it or not. And then 10 years later, I came back as a lecturer. And I've been working on genetic improvement of grain crops, mostly cereals, ever since. And most of my lab work is currently on sorghum and barley.
Great, next.
I'm happy to go next.
Okay.
Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in to this session, and well done to the committee for organising this session. I think it's great that QAAFI has a really dynamic student association and they do organise things like this, so well done. My name's Liz Dan. I'm in the Centre for Horticultural Science at QAAFI and I'm a plant pathologist. I'm based at Eco Sciences Precinct across the river from UQ. And at the moment, most of my research is on avocado diseases. So what are the pathogens and pests affecting avocado and how we manage them? I did my undergrad and PhD at the University of Sydney in agriculture faculty. And so I've sort of been in agriculture really and agricultural research for many, many years. And again, probably since most of you were born. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yasmina.
Can I go next? No. So hi, I'm Yasmina Sultanbawa and I'm a food scientist. and I work at the Center for Nutrition and Food Sciences, and I'm also the director of the RC Training Center for Uniquely Australian Foods. And we are very happy to have Pierre, one of our industry partners, joining us. Thank you, Pierre. So I work on the post-harvest end of things. So I'm not an agriculture growing person. So post-farm gate food resources is my research area and value addition. And I work on natural preservation technologies and innovative delivery systems for plant bioactives and also native Australian plant foods. So I have been in Australia for 13 years. So I'm originally from Sri Lanka, but I've traveled 4 continents to arrive in Australia. So I did my master's in England and my PhD in Canada, and now I'm in Australia. So I'm happy to be here. And I echo the same thing that Liz said. We are very proud of the QAAFI Student Association. You're doing a great job, and keep going, and very dynamic group of students. So very happy to be a part of it. Thank you.
Thank you to you, Yasmina. That's fantastic. Thank you. Okay, Lou, you can go now.
Right. Hi, everyone. My name is Lou Hoffman. I'm, I suppose, the new baby amongst the speakers today. So I've been here in Australia for 18 months now. Prior to that, I was doing research in South Africa. First 8 years in aquaculture, fish farming. After that, for 20 years as a meat scientist. So I'm a meat scientist. And I think the 2 areas that I did quite a bit of research on, which I think is applicable to today's talk and last week's talk, is one is I spent a lot of research looking at the meat quality and meat production of indigenous exotic species, in other words, the wildlife in South Africa. As you can see, the picture behind me is a kudu, one of the species. Looking at that and looking at how they fill different niches within the one farm. For example, you have a giraffe grazing at the top of the trees down to a duiker that is eating bushes down there, or a grazer, and this sort of combination of animals that you could have to get more kgs of meat per surface area. So that's the one area that I've done quite a lot of research. And the other one that I've also done some research is the use of fly larvae to cut down on waste and to upcycle waste into mainly three main foci, or 2 main focus. The one has been using these larvae to feed chickens and fish and other animals, and I would then come into the equation to answer the question, well, a consumer wants a chicken must taste like a chicken irrespective of what it's fed. So we would use scientific principles, analyze the fly larvae, see what changes their composition, and put it in balanced diets and feed it to chickens, and replace other proteins, vegetable proteins such as soya, with fly larvae, and look at the production potential of chickens and on pigs, and also in fish. And then I presently have a PhD student and some master students looking at the partial replacement of meat in hamburger patties with fly larvae, for example, and also making milk, ethno milk, and ice cream from fly larvae without any dairy products. So those are the 2 sort of areas that I'm playing around with. The fly larvae, particularly, putting it forward and carrying on with that research here in Australia. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So let's get started with the question and everything. Okay, so this year, as everyone knows, been a tough year. We face intense events like fires and now pandemic. So, which show that the availability of food is the most important thing for humans, also toilet paper. So how can we use research and innovation to meet the ongoing demand for food? So what do you think about it? Who wants to go first? And
Okay, I'll start. I think coming into Australia, one of the unique things that I find is that within QAAFI, we do cutting edge research, but it always has a very strong emphasis on the so what. What's the practical application for industry? And I think that's the first valuable step that we do our research, and most of the postgraduate students' research. But if I look at my own scenario and the 2 fields I spoke about, we've got to be very careful when we start looking at alternatives, that we don't push it in the direction that we've gone with monocrops or with cattle or with pigs, where we've become so driven to maximize productivity. And a lot of times the maximizing of productivity hasn't taken the environment and sustainability into account. So what we need to do is, when we do our research, we have to maintain this global picture of, and maybe do some life cycle analysis, even if it's only in the back of our mind. Because sometimes you might have a product that might not give you the yield per surface area. But if you look at the full life cycle analysis, it could be better off for sustainability.
That's great. So anyone wants to?
I can go next, and I'm going to boast here, because being a geneticist makes me a really lucky person, because people don't have to understand the technology of what people like me can deliver to farmers, or even people who want to eat the seeds. And let's face it, most of us, I don't think too many of us have probably not eaten a seed or a product of a seed today. Seeds are one of the ultimate technology delivery platforms, because you can give a seed to a farmer anywhere on the world, which has either new productivity, new sustainability, or new nutritional qualities embedded in that seed, and they don't even have to change necessarily what they're doing. Here's a wheat seed, go and plant it. You don't have to change what you're doing, but that wheat seed might actually have higher protein, a better nutritional quality, and require less nitrogen use out of the soil. All of the stuff that has happened doesn't change what the farmer necessarily has to do. It doesn't necessarily even change what the processor has to do. It's just better. And that's a pretty nice thing to be able to do. That's the sort of the dream for all of us. And I know amongst most geneticists, that's really the reason why we went into it, because we're amazed that we can do this sort of stuff, and yet the delivery is in a bag of seed or a potato. And I see that as a really nice use of the most modern scientific techniques that we have. Now, in saying that, of course, in many cases, it's not actually true that we can deliver something that gives something different and nothing else has to change. And I'll give you a specific example of that. You're probably all aware that our biggest export market for barley is China, and China uses it to make beer. The Chinese government got pissed off with the Australian government and said, we'll put an 80% tariff on that, and then no one in China will buy Australian barley. Well, you know what? Qingdao, the biggest brewer in China, still buys Australian barley. They pay the 80% extra. Why do they do that? Because if they had to switch to another source of barley, they would have to change all their processing, because the barley is actually a very small part of what goes into making beer. But they would have to change all their processing. There would be different cell wall components. There would be different things they'd have to filter out. And could they produce that same taste that Qingdao produces, that Chinese people like? No, not without a lot of messing around. So at the moment, it's actually easier for them to keep buying Australian barley and making the same beer as they always have.
Can I ask you a question, please? Yes.
Is that allowed?
Yeah, why not?
Yes.
I want to just quickly. I give due to the geneticists that you've made huge progress in food security, everything. But isn't there a threat that with the genetics and the type of application we do, we're losing important biodiversity? Particularly if we look at the impact of climate change, for example. So the question is, with the leaps that the geneticists have made in plants and in animals, are we not losing biodiversity? will we be able to regain it back? I know there are seed banks, but what about for the animals, for example?
That's a great question, and one answer to that question is meat chickens. And in the industrial world, we've gone from having meat chickens that were many different land races, improved varieties, etc., to going into intensive breeding. There's now two. There are two genotypes of meat chickens that are produced in most systems in the world because they've been bred to be the fastest growing and they have the greatest feed conversion ratios. And I agree that is a terrible genetic susceptibility, because if one disease comes through that both of those chicken types are susceptible to, for example, there's no meat chickens anymore. And we've seen some of that going on in the pork industry in China with African swine fever. So it's true, and we can create that sort of genetic vulnerability. And so another example I can think of, so in the early 1990s, Samoa, their main food is taro. You don't go through a day without eating taro. It's part of your national identity. Like much more important than pavlova and Vegemite and things like that to Australia. It's something you eat every day. It's on their 10, whatever it is, bill. There's taro there because everyone knows you can't live without taro. A disease came through, and because they only grew one type of taro that everyone liked, it was highly susceptible. They had no taro. Now, of course, international aid came to the rescue and they all got to eat maize and potatoes and other things like that. But the entire country went into mourning because their national identity had been destroyed by a single horrible little fungus. And yes, so the example is what Bo says is true. And that's why we really need to ensure that there is a high level of genetic diversity in everything we do.
So can I add to that, Emily? I think Ian and Lo, that's correct. You need to feed this 10 billion people in 2050. That's our biggest challenge. But I think that within those crops that you mentioned, Ian, we also need to get the underutilized crops in these countries that really are resilient to climate change. So the wild crops that these countries have. So diet diversity is going to be a big issue, big thing. And like Ian said, you can have it in one way where you have the genetics having a high protein grain. That's one way of going about it. The other way is to have diet diversity by eating a range of foods. And that's where I think the report that came out from the Lancet, by Harvard University and the climate change person in Germany, where they said that diet diversity and sustainable food systems are going to be a big role in, really feeding the planet, because this climate change is real and we need to address it. And that's where things like, other underutilized, like things like seaweed, algae, all this would be a part of the diet, because these are very sustainable systems. And that's where the innovation and the research would come in if we can add these to our diet. So I think both systems are important, but we should learn from learn from all the crops that are around so that we can improve it in a manner that we get affordable food and build resilient communities at the same time. So
we have a question that is related to this. So how can we create more sustainable farming system through eco-friendly disease and pest management? What practices should be implemented ahead?
Yeah, thanks. Being a plant pathologist, I feel I can probably add some weight to this. So we've made massive inroads with breeding, and Ian would know all about this, disease-resistant varieties. And that's been really, really crucial. And Australia's a classic case for that in our wheat rust breeding program over the last 120 years. So we've really made fantastic advances in our breeding programs, and that's continuing. We need to keep on top of our programs for breeding for these diseases, which are easy to breed for. They're not all easy to breed for, but rust is one which is, because it is a single gene mutation which the plant can overcome, or the fungus can overcome within the plant. So we need to keep on top of that. But there's other types of new innovative ways of managing diseases as well. And these include things like new types of pesticides. So getting a little bit away from the regular conventional fungicides and pesticides, and doing things like RNAi, which target specific gene pathways in pathogens. That's receiving a lot of headway now, and it's gone out to trial, which is great to see. A lot of these things are great in the glasshouse or in the lab, but take them out to the field trial, it's a totally different story. So we need to always be mindful that a success in the glasshouse doesn't always relate to success in the field. And also things like precision agriculture, so managing more precisely the fertilizer inputs, nutrient irrigation inputs is going to be really critical for particularly horticultural crops. And I guess I'm talking about tree crops, especially, where you can actually get down to single tree specificity. So with the use of all these tools and technologies and drones and mapping and imagery and so on, we can actually have a separate program for each tree in an orchard and just use or target its specific needs for nutrient and water. So that's saving a lot of waste of nutrients, saving a lot of waste of water, and it just gives the tree what's actually required. But also think that we need to appreciate that small incremental changes are also good, not always boast and be looking for massive game changes in technology, because really it's the small things which have contributed a lot so far. Resistance breeding is a step jump ahead, so it has massive increases in productivity. But I agree, we can learn a lot from countries which don't use monocultures. They use cover cropping and intercropping of different species. So I think we can learn a lot from other countries and how they manage their crops as well.
Thank you very much. That was great.
Yeah. Sorry, if I could just add on to that. So in one of my postgraduate students, what we looked at is as pests, and that is moths. And I'm talking about the codling moth as well as the moth, the cork borer on sugarcane. And what we did is we took basic animal science principles of balancing diets, and we used what they call the amino acid analysis of the full body of the insect. So what the principle behind it is, if you want to know what to feed an animal, you grind up the animal and you get the full amino acid and energy of that animal, and you feed it that. So what we went to the industry, because they were having problems getting, they were using the sterile male system. So in other words, you breed males and you make them all sterile by radiation. Then you set them free and they breed with a female, and all the offspring, all the eggs that they lay are infertile. And so you control the pests. But they weren't having good growth and survivability. And what they'd done is they went and said, well, the codling moth eats oranges, so let's feed them oranges, okay? But they just weren't getting that good, because insects tend to sometimes eat a variety of food. So what we did, using this technique of milling them up, we managed to double the survivability and cut the cost for the industry by 20%. So the point I'm just trying to make is we've spoken about genetic improvements, but there are many improvements that as good scientists we can bring to the industry. If you look at the increase in production of food over the years, a lot of the food has come from genetic improvements, and the other one also has come from improvements of farming practices. You saw the slide last week where just the rows of the planting was thinned out. So to come back to the science that we're doing here at UQ at QAAFI, a lot of it has the good fundamental basic science that you all learned in your undergraduate, and then it's the way that it's applied into a more advanced technical scenario background. And that's where we're going to go for the next generation. That's where we're going to be able to address a lot of these issues. Thanks.
Okay, that was a great discussion. So let's change a bit and ask this question. So we usually talk about feeding the world by increasing food production, but actually about 30% of the food produced globally is never being eaten. As scientists, how can we contribute toward reducing the food waste problem in the world? Who wants to go first?
Can I just go first?
Yes.
So we are post-harvest scientists. We are on the other end of the food chain. So Ian is the one who grows, I think, and Liz must be looking after the plants. But for us, getting funding even for post-harvest research is pretty tough because there is 30 to 40% wastage. But for us, it's heartbreaking that you take so much of effort to grow this plant and the food, and then you waste it on the other side. So I think food industries in the future will have to look at something known as circular economy. I think a lot of people have heard of it. And you will have to look at the resources and the energy and the water that you would use, say, to develop a food product. But it starts from the farm and then to the end product. You will have to understand what the wastage is. So for example, if you take a potato and you're going for maybe the chip industry, maybe you breed a potato of a particular size so that you can use it for the chip industry and you don't have a lot of wastage. Or if you do have wastage, then you need to do value addition. So the ones that do not form that particular size, maybe for the chip industry, you might have to do a potato salad with extended shelf life and have it as a processed product in the supermarket shelves, so that nothing is wasted, and you understand that the whole system is whatever you do is utilized. And then it's an onus, it's everybody's responsibility. It is the consumer's responsibility, the government and the industry and the growers. So everybody must be working together to minimize this 30%, because I just can't imagine that 2 billion people go hungry in the world and we have 30% post-harvest losses. It's just unacceptable. So it has to be addressed, but it is a concerted effort. It's just not one group. It has to be government policy and all that has to deal with that. So when you design...
I would agree with that, Yasmina, definitely. So one of the diseases that I work on, or actually two of them, I'm sure you're all familiar with when you cut open an avocado and you open it up and it's all got rots and you can't eat half of it because it's got horrible post-harvest rots. So
is it your fault?
It's my fault,
I know,
because I haven't come up with the solution yet, Ian. But I'm working on it. But when I give grower talks at field days, I tell them that quality, fruit quality, and it really applies to any commodity, is the responsibility of everybody in the supply chain. So the grower has to use every possible means available to him or her to provide a quality product. So a quality product without these infections, and they're mostly fungal diseases that I'm talking about, go into the supply chain, into storage, into transport, into post-harvest, downstream of the farm gate. It's got to be quality all the way through, and those processes perhaps have to be a little bit better integrated, and as Yasmina said, identify not just one end use but multiple end uses, so that nothing is wasted. So definitely, I think we've got to be a little bit more proactive at that in all industries.
Yes.
Okay, if I can come in here, I agree with what Yasmina said and the circular economy, but if I look at it globally, and coming from Africa, I think at the end of the day, it's all about economics. And that is the economics and the logistics are about moving food around. And in Australia, that's our biggest challenge, isn't it? we have a lot of surplus meat, everything that we got to move. And the problem is that we could say we have to look after the world. You know, we have the social responsibility. But at the end of the day, the whole world is driven by economics. And if it's not economical to get the food into Malawi, because people are starving here, to get it from Australia there, because no one's going to pay for it, because the people who are starving can't afford it. And that's one of our biggest problems, is this link to the economy, which drives it. And I really don't know what the answer is. Maybe you should get one of the clever economists who could try and explain to us how we're going to get over that one. But that to me is one of the major problems. That, and yes, food wastage is one. And an interesting one as well that I saw is linked to obesity. Someone was saying that if people who are overweight have to eat more to maintain their body, then if they weren't overweight, we would have enough food to feed another, I don't know how many million people a day, just because of the extra food people are eating who are overweight. So we're now back to this one health, this healthiness of the diet and what we need to eat. But I think our biggest challenge is linked to the logistics and the economy of the logistics.
Okay, good. So next question is for Liz. So at QAAFI, we are mostly doing industry-driven research. So how do consumer choices influence research innovation for sustainability?
Well, certainly in the avocado industry, the industry is very well supported by a levy. So each grower has to pay a levy to Hort Innovation, who then distributes funds for R&D. And as part of that, the industry likes to have surveys done on quality and consumer preferences. So that is a very big part of the industry strategy, is to providing what growers or what consumers want. So that's in terms of fruit colour, fruit taste, what percentage of these post-harvest diseases they might be willing to accept. And really, as consumers, I think we need to be more accepting of a little bit of black spot on a tomato, or a bit of a potato which has a bit of dry rot in the middle of it. We just have to cut it out and not be so precious about it. So I know I'm guilty of wanting to pick a lovely apple every time I go to the shops, but we just have to get away from that a little bit as well. But definitely the consumer choice and quality in avocados especially, and that probably helps my research, because a big part of quality comes down through these post-harvest fruit rots. So they're pathogens, they're diseases, and so that's always going to be a fairly significant component to a scientific research program, reducing those rots and those diseases. Because if we do want to export fruit or products long distances, then it's going to have to be good quality fruit, free or relatively free of these diseases for that situation. Did I answer that question?
Yes.
Can I add to that, Liz? So for my research, consumer choices are very important, because the food industry would have to deliver to the consumer choice. So we go from the consumer back to the farm gate, I suppose. So they don't want any chemical preservatives in their food. So they're moving away from chemical preservatives and additives. So you need to understand what they require. So they don't want any artificial color. I mean, the Southampton study that was done in the UK is quite old, but it's a good example of how the sodium benzoate and tartrazine as a color reacted and really caused some hyperactivity in children. And then Aldi, the supermarket, on its own, even before any regulations came, on its own decided to remove their artificial colors. And if you go to the Aldi stores, they're all natural colors. So I think that is a good way of industry really listening to the consumer And then where the research opportunity is for us to understand that, okay, now the consumer is looking for natural, how can we remove preservatives from the food system? So things like benzoate, sulfites, nitrates, nitrites that are added and that do have hazards on your body, it is known. If we can replace that with functional ingredients from plants that would extend the shelf life and improve the storage and also benefit the health of the consumer, then that is a good market and the industry would be very interested because they want to sell more products. So consumer choice is very, very critical, I think, for research.
That's cool. That's very well. And so the next question for
Can I
you.
just quickly say something around consumers? Sorry. I agree consumers drive, but sometimes, and it's an area that I don't see a lot of research done, and that is what is driving consumer choices. So from my own background in the meat and in South Africa, the fresh meat, higher income processed meat that goes through the formal chain is dominated by 3-4 supermarket groups, right? And on the top of the group is a company called Woolworths. So I wanted to test consumers' perceptions about animal welfare and free range versus non-free range chickens, right? So what I did is I had my students stand outside the shop and ask people, if you had a choice between free range and intensive produced broiler meat, which would you buy? And they all said free range. And I call that one the social response. So we thanked them and they went to the shop, and I had another student, unbeknown to them, follow them to see what they put in the basket. And they always put in the basket the cheaper option, which was the intensive one. And that's the economy in reality, right? And then I also did another trial with students where I had 2 groups of chickens, one raised free range and the other raised intensively, fed the same diet. So they actually tasted quite similar. And then I asked the students, which would you prefer, free range or intensive? And about 60% said free range and 40% said intensive. Then I gave them a blind taste and I had both chickens in front and I asked them, which would you prefer? And they said 50% was A and 50% B. And then I put the label on the chickens and I said, A is free range, B is intensive. There was 60% for free range, 40% for intensive. Then I switched the tags and I still got the same of A for intensive. So the knowledge of what I'm buying is good, right, influences my choice. And it would be interesting to see what are the drivers of what consumers want. And I think why I'm mentioning this is the youth, a lot of you doing postgraduate students, you're part of the consumers that I call that are really living up to experiences, flexitarians. You know, you're out for ultimate experiences, be it from physical activities, skydiving, whatever, and also eating experiences. And that's where a lot of these novel foods come in, because it's an eating experience. But today you might go for kangaroo meat and tomorrow you might go for tofu meat or something else, totally different. And that is a challenge for us. It's because the up and coming market, which is the younger generation, is to try and predict what you people want, because we have no idea what experience tomorrow is going to be in and which one's going to be out tomorrow. And that's one of our challenges.
You are right. Lou, I just wanted to add to the conversation because you are so right that our generation is probably the one that's most influenced by the trends. People moving on to vegan diets, onto vegetarian diets, and also probably even being more conscious about what the choices are. I know for sure that consuming avocados is widely popular in our generation. Liz, do you want to add on to that? For example, when people are moving on to these trends, for example, the one about avocado, this is very water intensive, for example. So how can we probably educate people into do a better choice as scientists, I think?
Yeah, I saw that in the question, and so I looked up water use of a few crops. I got onto a really good site that the cotton industry put out. So cotton uses about 6 to 7 megalitres per hectare per year. Rice uses about 11.5 megalitres per hectare. Fruit and nut crops, they've pulled them and called them 5 megalitres per hectare, and veggies at 4 megalitres per hectare. But I know just in WA, in the 2 main avocado growing regions, avocado uses 7 to 8 megalitres per hectare in one region on loam soils and 15 megalitres per hectare in sandy soils. So just within one crop, it's the same rootstocks, it's the same variety. They vary greatly with this water use and how efficiently that's used. But I think if your generation, once you smashed avo and your cappuccinos and so on, and clearly you do, and that's great, great that you do. If you're going to want to know what goes behind that, then maybe some people don't like how much water one avocado tree uses. It's a tropical tree. So it's a conscious decision to either eat avocados, which does use a fair bit of water, or not eat avocados. But the science and the technology is improving such that water use efficiency is getting much better. So things like drip irrigation, as I mentioned before, precision agriculture, where we can maybe irrigate each tree separately according to what it actually needs. The instrumentation, so that irrigation only comes on when that tree actually needs the moisture, and even working out exactly how much water a tree does use and when are the critical times that it's needed, is quite critical. But I think there's a lot of other crops that use a lot more water than avocado.
Yeah, and I think that that's actually the question that we here as scientists we should be having, because if we're investing resources into making more resilient crops for water usage, that's great, and I think we're doing progress towards that. I see Lou has a question.
Yeah, I have a question, and that is, I think one of the challenges, how do we express it? Do we, we've just heard volumes per surface area for crops.
Yeah, you can't do it per hectare. It's a useless figure.
Exactly. I would like to see us start looking at energy and water per kg or per gram protein or per kilocalorie energy. Then it's going to be different. People love comparing meat and, say, grains. But meat has over 78% water, grains have less than 12%. So what are you comparing? So we need to start looking at that. But that's for us as scientists. I think the challenge is then, how do we get this over to Joe Soap, the man in the street, the public? We can debate this as scientists, but also how do we get it across there? And something that I've been thinking about, which I would ask the student body, is shouldn't we be looking at UQ of having a basic course for all students, say at first year, where we just teach the students, particularly those that are not in a scientific discipline, about some of the principles. What is GMO? What is animal welfare? What are pesticides? Because the reason I'm asking this is these are the people in 10, 15 years' time who will be voting on these matters. But do they actually know the science behind it? Or do they follow Professor Google, www, which gives credibility to mediocrity? Yeah? So how do we get the A, for our own thinking, and B, how do we get it to the masses, that they start looking at it in that scenario and not just following the sort of public what's in at the moment?
Yeah, I was going to add to that you can use whatever figures you want, but it comes down to it's really, really hard to actually compare things. If you're saying, okay, rice uses 3 times the water per hectare of apples, for example. Okay, well, what's the dry matter that you get from those apples per unit area? I'm not talking about the weight, because remember, most of an apple is water. What's the dry matter of rice? Rice is going to give you 15 tonnes per hectare. In fact, per unit calorie, rice is actually one of the most efficient food producers in the world. And that's why it's actually the most eaten cereal in the world. It's not because people think rice is the most wonderful thing on the planet, it's because it's actually the most efficient way to get calories into you. Unfortunately, they're not particularly good calories because it's nearly all starch. But I want to just segue into another little thing that that gets me, is that most of the stuff that creates the fashions, and you have an Instagram, you know, person who's, you know, absolutely totally buff with their six-pack and all that, and they tell you this is what you should do, and you think, oh wow, that's what I should go and do, because I think they're a good person, a good source of information, so I'll go and do that. And it gets to the stage where science isn't actually part of food marketing. And I'll give you an extreme example. For those of you who shop at Coles, they have this potato variety called the Charisma potato. The Charisma potato has lower GI. Everyone knows what GI is. It's got lower GI. It must be good for me. When that Charisma potato was launched, I just about had an epileptic fit, because I went in there and there were all these signs up and they said, Charisma potato, created without scientists. Now, what was that supposed to say? It talked to the average person saying, yes, I don't want a scientist interfering with my food. I want those potatoes that were exactly the same as they were in the Garden of Eden, or wherever potatoes evolved. Oh no, they didn't evolve because they were in the Garden of Eden, whatever. So, but what it said to me, this is the thing that made me angry. And the fortunate thing was I was then on a radio interview 2 days later talking about food, and I used this as an example. I said, these were created without scientists. Is that because scientists are evil? What's the story? But they weren't created without scientists, because they involved plant breeders, they involved plant pathologists, they involved agronomists, they involved food scientists, they involved nutritionists, etc., etc., etc. There were scientists involved in every part of the creation of this new potato, and even a scientist telling us they had a lower GI, whatever that means. The average person, we are not average people, we are scientists, end of story. And we can never understand the way this marketing works because we're scientists. And that's one of our biggest problems, because we think like a bloody scientist all the time.
Excellent summary, Jan. You put it really well. But I think that also ties in with the concept of reducing our consumption of meat. That's the trend these days. So Lou, do you have an opinion on that, you as a meat scientist? And what do you think about, for example, promoting insects as an alternative protein source?
If I can come in here, I don't think worldwide there's a decrease in meat consumption. If I look at the statistics, it's again how you make the statistics work. If I have insectivores, right, people who eat insects, if I have 10,000 of them, and in 1 year they go up to 20,000, I've had a 100% increase. But if I've got 60 million people who are eating meat, and it increases by 1,000, then it's less than 0.01%, right? So you've got to be careful when people give these figures. Worldwide, the meat consumption hasn't gone down. One of the realities is, as your income increases, and remember we have a huge group of people with low income, as your income increases, you tend to go towards meat, and it starts white and then it goes red meat up the scale. And a lot of people are moving up the scale, that's one. But it's the people who I have this catchphrase, don't criticize agriculture with a full stomach. And we're fortunate in Australia, life is good. We can afford to be critical and start saying, I don't want to eat this, I want to eat that. But what I find interesting is the producers, the meat producers, they see this whole non-meat products as a threat. Yet if I look worldwide, the big meat processing companies have all started startups in alternative proteins. And they don't see it as a threat. They just see it as another alternative for someone to eat. Because what's happening, your generation again, is as part of the experiences, you're eating different things. So it's interesting that the big companies have embraced this idea of plant proteins coming in and insects coming in. What I find interesting, just from an academic viewpoint, is the name and the big argument going about, should you call a meatless burger a burger or a chicken finger, you know, should around the names. And there's some countries, France, for example, and Germany, have said a burger is only a burger if it's got meat in it. But I've got news for them, or a sausage is only a sausage. But, you know, I've been formulating for the industry sausages, particularly these breakfast, these hot dog sausages that contain 40% plant protein, and I've been doing it for 30, 40 years because plant protein is cheap. But I've never said that to anyone because people want to eat what they perceive to be meat. Okay? So it's all in the labeling and the marketing, isn't it? So I find it interesting. And to me, it's a challenge, if I'm a protein expert, to see how these plant proteins react and to get binding. I made an insect Vienna sausage, which was great for 3 days, and then it lost all water binding capacity because there wasn't any fiber in there, and it just became a muck and just a lot of goo. But up until 3 days, it tasted great, everything. So, you know, as a scientist, it's interesting. How can we bring in some of the textures that was spoken of last time, the textures in these products from the meat, and how can we combine it with the plants to get something that looks like and tastes like? But I'm also piqued by the idea, why does a consumer want to eat a burger that doesn't have meat but that looks and tastes like a meat burger? You know, why not go and have your own tofu type of product? Or is it so ingrained that in us that we're eating meat? And just as an aside, meat is the only product that contains elastin. And as humans, we have an enzyme, elastase. So that shows we evolved to eat meat, right? So I must admit, I'm biased. I don't eat vegetables, but anyway, I don't like the taste of vegetables. But
yeah, just to let you know that Lo doesn't eat vegetables, and don't listen to him too much.
But the point is, as a meat scientist, I don't see these alternatives as a threat to the industry per se. Because the reality is, and it was touched on last time, and from our research on these alternative animals, there's a lot of areas in the world where we don't have rich enough soils with enough water to have crops. We can only have natural vegetation, and then the best machine to convert that into a usable product for us to consume is a ruminant animal. So we will always have cattle, sheep, goats, wildlife, kangaroos, whatever around for us to eat.
Thank you very much. So the next question is for Yasmina. So since we are in Australia, we haven't talked about native Australian food. So what is the challenge of making Australian native food more accessible in the market? Are native Australian food more sustainable option for customer, for our consumption?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I can talk on it for hours, so I'll just try to do it in 3 minutes. Yes, it is sustainable. There's a lot that we can learn from Australian native foods in terms of sustainability by looking at how the indigenous communities have grown these products. So I think we really need to understand the link between how the indigenous communities look at healthy food, sustainable agriculture, caring for country. All this comes together. And they also have these fire burning practices that also looks after the land. And the plants that Australian native plants grow in Australia. So it is sustainable. It is growing in the soil and conditions that is suitable for Australia. So that becomes very attractive in terms of these crops being in the ideal state that they should be growing in. And it has been eaten for over 50 or 60,000 years. So if you, I mean, a great study done by UQ, Anna Florin, the PhD student who worked in Western Arnhem Land, and she looked at the charred remains of some of the, the indigenous people who lived about 53,000 years ago, and she found Buchanania obovata, Buchanania species. So if you can see the picture behind me, that is green plum. and they found charred remains of green plum. So green plum, even today, it's there, and it's been there for a long time. And if you read Bruce Pesco's book on dark emu, if you haven't, I would encourage you to read it. He talks of agricultural practices that were there, that were practiced. So they had irrigation, they looked after the crops, they understood how to process, they did storage. So there's a lot that we can learn. So to me, the message today is that Australian natives are very important for us to understand how the indigenous people did their agricultural practices, and for all of us to learn from each other. And for us to be able to use, I like to call it ancient ingredients in modern foods. So if we can incorporate these indigenous, native plant foods with potent antioxidant and nutrient properties into our daily diet, that becomes very attractive in the sense that you get the diet diversity. So there's a lot of learning to do from the communities, and for us to learn from them, and for us also to extend that knowledge to them in consultation with them. So it's going to be a very important part in sustainability.
Thank you very much, Yasmina. Oh yes, there is a question from Laura.
Right. I have a question for both Yasmina and for Ian, and that is, as the uptake of these indigenous fruits grows, we're going to start cultivating them more and more because as the uptake goes, the price is going to go up, and we're going to have producers who are going to look at producing them. So I have a question to both Ian and Yasmina. Don't they think that with the more commercial-like farming practices, we're going to lose some of the valuable nutritional factors that are in part of the fruit as it is at the moment? I hope the question makes sense.
I'll let Yasmina go first, but she's muted.
So for me, I mean, I've worked in all across Northern Australia. The terrain is quite harsh, and they're all wild harvested, and they're all rain-fed agriculture. So there is no fertilizer or anything being used, but it is very sustainable because these people know the land. They know how to grow their crops, and they know what to grow, which plants to grow. So there is no pest attack, or we don't lose crops in the wild. But I don't know whether those potent antioxidant and some of those nutrients will be still there if we start irrigating and doing cultivation. But there are also two sides to this story, because you must remember that these are their knowledge, and if we get this traditional knowledge to branded products, we need to have a lot of consultation with the owners of this plant material. So it has to be in consultation to see whether they are interested in cultivation. They might want enrichment planting within communities, and they're still not ready for cultivation. So you need to have those conversations, intense conversations, to see whether the communities are ready for cultivation. But things like acacia species, which is grown all over the world, and Australia has about 130 species, I think, that are edible. It's a little bit of a different story, because in Victoria, you do get indigenous communities who are cultivating now because they have land. But I don't know whether the nutrient properties are still going to be there at those levels when you start looking after the plant and making it comfortable. Ian, you can add.
Yeah, sure. I was going to add to that, Yasmina, that most plant species that have gone through some level of domestication, there's a couple of management things that we always like to alter. And it doesn't matter whether it's a grass or a fruit tree. We don't want the fruit to drop off. That's one of the domestication traits we always like to use. In nature, it's good to drop the fruit and spread the seeds around, because that's how you make new little baby ones. We don't want that in domestication. We want the fruits to stay on the plant. That involves some fairly, we understand what those sorts of domestication things are. The other thing that a lot of things have gone through from a domestication point of view, the removal of toxins. In some of those, we use post-harvest ways of removing the toxins, but more often, we're eating versions of them that no longer make that toxin. Every single part of the tomato plant is toxic to us, except the fruit. And the same with potatoes. Every single part of the plant is toxic to us, except the potato. In nature, the potato and the tomato are still actually toxic. So if you get a wild one, it's a good idea not to eat it because you'll die from alkaloid poisoning. But we have selected mutants that no longer do that. And that's where the domestication took the potato from being an occasionally eaten. The history of potatoes is that the people in the Andes used to actually take it up into the high mountains and let it freeze and thaw out. And that was generally enough to leach most of the toxins out of it during that time. But you couldn't pull a potato out of the ground and eat it. So you took it up, let it freeze, get rid of the toxins, bring it back down the next season, and then it's safe to eat. Cassava still has to have treatments like that because of cyanogenic glucosides. We don't need to do that with most of our domesticated crops. In saying that, there was a potato bred in the 1960s and it was just about to be released. And some food scientists did some tests on it and worked out, how about no, because it was actually full of alkaloids.
All right. Thanks, Ian, for that. Well, on the interest of time, I'm gonna open the floor for questions from the public. We do have one in the comments here. And this one is for Jasmina and Liz. Someone commented, yes, food diversity is one of the ways to go, and consider underutilized plants, those resilient to harsh environment and highly nutritious, as moringa. Why not trying this miracle tree in Australia? Do you want to give an opinion on this?
I'm not sure. I think there is a type, Ian, correct me if I'm wrong, the plants, isn't there moringa in Australia?
Yeah, you can. I don't think there's a lot of commercial cultivation, but some people grow it in their back gardens. Yeah.
I have one in my back garden. That's what I was wondering.
Well, there you go.
This person also commented, another point is the intercropping is needed to be considered as well in our future research. I don't know what it means, intercropping. Can you explain to us?
Yes, so intercropping, and I'm really talking about horticulture here and tree crops, is where, for example, within an avocado orchard under the trees or in the interrow, you might also plant a cash crop, or you might plant another...
Marijuana.
Yeah. Marijuana, bananas, some other type of crop which can be a cash crop, can be a food crop, and this is done fairly extensively in many third world countries. So that means that it's not a monoculture. There's a couple of different crops being grown there, and that increases diversity. It can also improve soil health because you're having a range of different crops which you're not leaving the interrow free. You're putting a crop in there, and it's improving the diversity of insects and so on, helps pollination. There's all sorts of good reasons why intercropping is a good thing, and we used to do it in avocados. We used to interplant with New Zealand blue lupins or forage sorghum, and because the growers saw that as a bit hard to manage and access with their machines to go and spray pesticides and weeds and so on was a bit difficult, they stopped doing it. But I'm actually trying to encourage some growers to at least put something in the interrow, even if it's a short season crop, and they can use the rainfall, natural rainfall, to irrigate it, and then either cultivate it in as a green manure to increase organic matter and soil carbon and thus microbial diversity within soil, or slash it and put it underneath the trees as some more mulch. But there's a lot of reluctance to do that.
I suppose you could add that historically, like farming systems 100 years ago, there weren't that many farms that didn't have animals on the farm. And I mean, sometimes it was actually the animals were on the farm because there wasn't a tractor. There wasn't a way of getting things to market without those animals. So intercropping and those sorts of ways of doing rotations were part of making farming sustainable because the animals were an important part of what the farming did. The modern farmers have tended to specialise more, and let's face it, animals are a pain in the ass because you can put a truck in the garage and you only need to do something with it when you need to take stuff to market or cart something somewhere. But if you've got a horse, you've got to feed it year round. And so animals became a hugely reduced part of Australian agriculture over the last 30 to 40 years. And even in most sort of cattle or sheep properties, a lot of the places, they don't use horses anymore to do any of the stock treatments. It's all motorbikes, etc., helicopters.
All right. We also have another question here. It has a bit of a background to it, but is how can scientists take charge of the information that's going to the public? This is in regards to how people are sometimes misinformed by the website.
Wish we knew.
That's true. I think we can clearly see the effect that misinformation has had in the pandemic. So now if we kind of try to tackle about climate change and all of the food choices that we have, it's just a really huge discussion to me.
But, if I can come in there, what I did when I was still in South Africa, I made friends with a number of reporters. And I had a reporter, because as a scientist, what I write is boring to read. My papers are boring to read. Even to myself, I fall asleep sometimes reading my own papers. So how will Joseph find it interesting? So what I did, and I need to do the same here now in Australia, is I found a good journalist who had a scientific background, and I would send them my papers. And they would then write 100 or 200 page out of it and send it back to me. And I would edit that the scientific content was correct. And then I would sign off for this, say, right, go for it. And all I wanted to see was my institution's name and the link to the scientific paper somewhere. And then they could go sell it to whoever they want to do whatever they want with it. And I think that might be a way for us to go about that. You know, we should try at least every 1 out of 5 papers that we publish to get it out into the proper, into the softer social media. But to do that, you need a specialist who knows how to write for the public consumption. Now, scientists, we tend to train our students how to write scientific papers, and they're written totally different. And you start writing a paper about probability and p-values, and I mean, you've lost the public totally. So that could be one of the ways to do it. The other way is you younger generation, you know, you're more clued up with blogs and hashtags. I don't even know how to use a hashtag or anything like that. Yeah. So maybe the challenge is for you also to get the information out there.
I think it's our comms teams that really can help us as scientists put the message out there to the greater public. And I think they're doing that to a degree, but perhaps they need to do that a little bit more.
Yeah.
And articles like The Conversation, so that's for the mass population. And I think that vehicle is really, really important. And the sort of articles that you do, Ian, as well, in your book and so on, is really important to get that information out to Joe Blow, so that they're not afraid of the science and they're not afraid of us scientists. It's important to get us perceived as not being scary.
Yeah. I was very rude to everyone before and told you that you think like scientists. But I then thought, well, do we? Because we like to say that we're data driven. And like, I know when I go online and read news stories. If it's something that I know something about, I nearly always think, that's not right, that's an oversimplification. But all the other stuff, I just read it and I say, wow, really? That's terrible. But someone sitting next to me who maybe has a degree in medicine would be reading the same thing saying, that's bullshit, that's not right. It's part of the things that we understand, the things that we take in, the things that we are interested in. I can't really do a questionnaire here, but if I was to say to you, okay, we all know red meat is going to kill us and red meat is going to destroy the planet, everyone accepts that, right? Because red meat is the biggest, especially cattle, they're the biggest greenhouse gas emitters in the entire world. Do you know the real figures? So in places like Australia and North America, the greenhouse gas emissions of the entire cattle industry, which includes, it's not just the cows themselves, it includes all of the on-farm activities, all of the getting it to the market, et cetera, is 3% of the total greenhouse gases. So if we actually reduced the greenhouse gases on farm of cattle by half, it might reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 1%. Now, 1% is not to be sneezed at, but it's 1%. We are in a sort of situation where there's this acceptance amongst the general public and ourselves of facts like cattle are terrible, they emit all the greenhouse gases. It's we should just stop eating cattle, end of story. But it's not a very true reflection of reality, in fact. And there is an element of truth in the fact that the figures put about cattle being major greenhouse gases, the people who are putting those out might have a vested interest because you can trace a lot of it back to companies who go under the names like Shell, Exxon, BP, etc. This is where some of that stuff actually comes from.
If I can add there, I agree with you, Ian. Always be aware of the reasons the messenger is selling a specific story. You know, I would be selling meat because I'm a meat scientist, but always be aware of where that person's coming from. And one thing I've learned from a lot of reporters is a lot of reporters are lazy. They don't want to read the scientific paper. They read what someone else has written, and then they try and put a spin on it to try and make it a wow factor so that they can sell it. So I 4 years ago, you know, when the Horse-Gate scandal broke, I just to give an example of the power of the media, at that stage, before the Horse-Gate scandal broke, I actually did a DNA study of sausages sold in South Africa, because the sausage is the dustbin of the butchery. All the offcuts you chuck in there. And I had a postdoc, we were actually looking at fish and mislabeling of fish using DNA. And I said to her, while you're going around, take sausages in all the shops that you have. And we did an analysis of the sausages, and we actually found donkey in one of them, right? So she presented the results at a food science conference in August of the year in South America, in Brazil. And when she came back, she was partly funded to go by the South African Food Science and Technology Association. So she gave a paper, and on page 3 of the newspaper, there was a little one paragraph that donkey found in meat, and that was it, right? And then in end of January the next year, the paper was published in Food Control. And then I sent it off to my scientific popular writer, 3 papers, and said, I like this one. And she emphasized the donkey, right? So then we came, and she then put it out to the Afrikaans media first, and they said, we're not interested in it. So 2 days later, she sent it to the English newspapers. But in those 2 days period, the Horse-Gate scandal broke in Europe. And suddenly this, what was work done 4 months ago and published on page 4 was suddenly front page news. And I had these people phoning me, and the reporters, each one wanted to send samples to have analyzed, because each reporter wanted to be able to say, we went and bought sausages and we sampled them and we also found snake in the sausage, or whatever it is, okay, to try and sell the story. And it was a lot of mediocre science. What to me was shocking was the experimental outlay. Then they wanted to know who was the butcher who sold the donkey meat. But that wasn't I refused to give that information until I had a court order that said I had to give access to Information Act, because the experiment wasn't designed to compare different shops and what they put in their sausages. The experiment was designed to see what is in sausages, if you understand what I mean. So, but the actual reporters twisted it to sell the story. And I mean, there was over 500 samples and there was one donkey in just one sample, but that became the leading thing. So the point is, reporters are always following each other and each one wants to add on something to make it even more enticing and more sexy, the paper that they're working on.
All right. Thanks, Lou, for that. I think that with everything that we said today, we just really scratched the surface of very important issues for sustainable food production. Charlotte, we have one last question, right?
Yes, this would be like a take-home message for everyone. So what do you think that it's going to be the future of food? Since we discussed about like all this thing today, so for you, what's going to be the future of our food? Who wants to go first?
Kombucha.
Kombucha.
It tastes healthy.
Good for you, that definitely.
For me, the future of food is having food that is affordable for everybody. There should be equity, and especially vulnerable populations. To me, the future of food should be that it's available for everybody. And I think if we can have zero hunger and zero poverty, that would be my future for food.
Yeah, I know. And the technologies and so on used to produce the food have to be affordable and accessible to everyone in the world. And I know I like, often when Mike Gidley talks, he doesn't talk about food security, he talks about nutrition security. So I think we may have a good abundance of food, but it's how that food is used and consumed, which is another big Pandora's box of issues in itself. So we need food. I like food. I like meat. I like vegetables.
Excellent. Thanks, Liz.
I think from my side, I think the future is going to be a balanced diet, no matter what's on the plate. But I see, to try and get that balanced diet, I see more and more of the nutrients going to come in pill form. So we're going to be taking, you're going to have your diet and you're going to have a whole bunch of handful of supplements that you take with it.
So I have grown-up children who all spent a lot of time watching me in the kitchen, cooking with me in the kitchen, and now when they're not getting Uber Eats, they're getting Hello Fresh or Marley Spoon. Okay, I mean, they're working, they've got good jobs, they can afford it. But I actually see, and again, this comes back to the sorts of things that Mike Gidley says a lot of food that is going to be eaten in places like Australia in the future is going to be for its taste, some of it might be fashion as well, but convenience. Convenience in that you don't have to look up a Jamie Oliver YouTube every time you want to cook something to work out, what can I make? Oh, I've got some ham, 3 eggs, a mushroom and some cheese. Like I know, I just make an omelette, end of story. But for a lot of people, no, they want the convenience, and that's going to become increasingly the case. That's my belief. And I also believe that that means that, unfortunately, the people who are growing the food are going to become an ever diminishing percentage of the value that is ended up being paid for the food that people are eating.
All right. Thank you so much, guys. We've been way much over time here, but this has been just a very flourishing discussion. So a big thank you for taking the time and joining this session. Big thank you to Jasmina, Liz, Lou, and Ian for being our panelists today. So we will approach our last session next week, and this will be our final session from our seminar series. It will take place on Thursday at 3:30 p.m. and it will focus on driving sustainability and innovation in the global food industry. We have very excited that we have speakers, a speaker from Fonterra, the sustainability manager. We have Pia Winberg from Venus Shell Systems, a seaweed expert there. Then a startup from Amsterdam, Billy Craft, who makes plant-based cheese, and a business development manager from Food HQ, which is an innovation hub. So we are very excited for this session, and make sure you can join to wrap up our Future Foods for a Sustainable Planet discussion. So thank you.
Thanks, Ian. Thanks, Lee, Nina, Lou. Really great
you for
discussion.
having
Really enjoyed.
Very much for being with us.
Thanks for asking. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for asking. It's been a good session. Well done.
Very interesting, and thank you very much.
See ya.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
That's all right.